Okay, well, I think we'll start on time. So a very good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to this forum, organised and hosted jointly by the Centre for Theology and Public Issues and CSAFE, the Centre for Sustainability, Agriculture, Food, Energy and the Environment. My name's Andrew Bradstock. I'm Director of the Centre for Theology and Public Issues, and I'll be chairing and coordinating the first half, and then we'll be throwing the meeting open to questions and discussion, and Dr. Janet Stevenson, the Director of CSAFE, will be chairing and facilitating the second half. Just a little plug, if you're interested in the kind of meetings that we organise at the Centre for Theology and Public Issues, and you aren't already on our mailing list, do take the opportunity to sign up on the way out. There's a sign-up sheet there if you'd like to be on our mailing list, and also some literature about the centre if you'd like to know more about it. Well, this is an opportunity to discuss one of the, if not the big issues of our time, climate change, and in particular some of the ethical issues around it. And we're very privileged to have an expert panel with us this afternoon, and I'll introduce them to you in a minute. But just what do we mean by exploring ethical issues around climate change? Well, given what the global scientific community tells us is happening to our planet, what kind of issues does that knowledge raise for us? How should we respond? Well, one response might be actually, of course, to welcome climate change, to say, bring it on. It's going to have lots of benefits. And you might have seen recently, for example, the comments by the Chief Executive of New Zealand Wine Growers, Philip Gregan, who points to the fact that New Zealand has long had trouble producing wines in significant export quantities due to its weather. But he says that may change. Higher temperatures due to global warming are expected to make cold areas more temperate and better suited to grape cultivation. So it's no surprise, he says, that wine growers are upbeat about a future that includes climate change. The big picture, he says, for New Zealand wine is very, very good. Or, if that didn't cheer you up, perhaps some words from Tim Shadbolt, the Mayor of Invercargill, might do the job. He thought global warming would attract more tourists, especially to the South Island. Shadbolt says, "We reckon with global warming kicking in and all this catastrophic climate change coming, maybe having a cold climate could work in our favour." Shadbolt said that his fellow townspeople liked to think they were environmentally conscious, but secretly were all thrilled to hear that world temperatures were set to rise by 2 degrees. There were cheers across the city. It will be warmer, and this will be the place people want to be. So welcome to Invercargill, tomorrow's Tauranga. Now, of course, there are big questions over how realistic that is as a picture of New Zealand's future. But behind all that, there are some very fundamental questions in this for all of us. How will we feel if our quality of life is maintained here or even improved, whilst around us other people in other countries, including, of course, islands in the South Pacific, suffer terrible consequences as a result of our inaction on climate change? Or what impact will leaving a challenging legacy for future generations have on the way that we see ourselves today? And how might a decision not to take a leading role internationally impact on the psyche of New Zealanders? Well, that's just a few questions, and to help us kind of unpack and explore some of these big questions are our panel this afternoon, which I'm now going to introduce to you in the order in which they're going to speak to us. Dr. Jim Salinger in the middle is well-known and much respected climate change scientist who until early 2009 worked for the Crown Research Institute NIWA, the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research. And as well as Jim's high-profile work for NIWA, he's best known for his involvement with IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which, as you know, is the body tasked with reviewing and assessing the most recent scientific and technical information produced worldwide that's relevant to understanding climate change. And Jim is a lead author with IPCC. And of course, in that capacity, Jim shared the Nobel Prize in 2007 with other members of IPCC and Al Gore. Jim was actually born here in Dunedin, but is now based in Auckland, and is currently with Rod Oram and Professor Caroline Saunders from Lincoln University undertaking a roadshow going around the country to raise awareness and promote dialogue around climate change with farming and other communities across the country, and they were doing that with local farmers here this afternoon, earlier today at the Edgar Centre. That leads me on to Rod, nearest to me here, who will also be well known to many of you as a commentator in the media and a writer on business and economic matters. Rod has a regular column in the Sunday Star Times and Good magazine, and frequently appears on radio and TV. And Rod has more than 30 years' experience as an international financial journalist, working both in Europe, including for the Financial Times in London, and in North America. And since moving to New Zealand in 1997, Rod has been an adjunct professor in the business school at Unitec, Auckland's tertiary technology institute, and was recently commissioned by the Royal Commission on the Governance of Auckland to write a briefing paper on Auckland in the year 2060. Will we live to see that? Rod is author of Reinventing Paradise, How New Zealand is Starting to Earn a Bigger Sustainable Living in the World Economy. And of course the theme of sustainability will be central this evening, and of course to the roadshow that Rod is doing with Jim and Caroline. And the third member of our panel is Laura Black, Chief Executive and Director of the Methodist Mission based here in Dunedin. Laura has 25 years' experience of working with community and voluntary sector organisations, and has been involved in a whole host of NGOs and organisations, including Samaritans and Welfare Rights Team, Women's Refuge, the Small Business Centre, NMIT Tatari Māori Programme Advisory Committee in Nelson, and various other bodies concerned with young people, housing, which will be one of her themes this evening, outdoor pursuits, and community radio. She's also been involved at national level in the UK trade union movement, and has also, of course, worked here at the University of Otago as head of our Alumni and Development Office. And Laura is also currently a member of the Institute of Directors and a JP. So that's our expert panel who are going to lead us in the first half of our session this evening. And I suppose I ought to say, since we're looking at ethical issues, and this meeting is co-hosted by the Centre for Theology and Public Issues, Jim describes himself as ethnically and culturally Jewish. Rod is a practicing Anglican, and Laura is a professional Methodist. Work that one out. Anyway, I'm going to invite each to speak for 10 to 15 minutes max, and then I'll sit down and Janet will chair. There'll be a roving mic going round, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion and questions. So without further ado, what are the potential impacts of climate change on our ethics, morals and national identity if we do just sit back and enjoy the grapes? Jim.
Thank you, Andrew, and kia ora, tēnā koutou te kaua, and it's nice to be in Dunedin with the northeasterly wilting and the northwesterly coming in. So really I will take aspects from the Jewish tradition, but I just want to very quickly say that temperatures are warming up, glaciers are shrinking, and Arctic sea ice is disappearing rapidly. So it's all happening and sea levels are rising. And really the important ethical issue we face is where we are now, and we're really at the Y-junction of making decisions. We can really haul back on rapid development of new technology and just keep temperatures 2 degrees, or we can just increasing use of fossil fuels, and off we are to a 4 or maybe 5 degree future by the end of this century. And the impacts of that will be dramatic. Last week I was in the Pacific Islands. We're looking at climate and fisheries, but the issue there is people in Tuvalu and Kiribati are going to have to relocate. Now imagine if you have to move, you no longer have a sovereign country, what that means. And this is wisdom from Tim Flannery from the Australian Climate Commission. This is the critical decade. Decisions we make now to 2020 will determine the severity of climate change and our children and grandchildren experience. we're basically on the roller coaster. And we've set planetary process adrift, and we really have to get active. And these show you fossil fuel emissions. We are not doing well. We're very much on a business as usual scenario. And then we spill the planet into tipping points, and you get disappearing Greenland, 1 to 2 degrees Arctic sea ice melts, boreal forests die back, continental glaciers go, and West Antarctic ice sheet. These show you the various trigger points which are pushing the climate system beyond what civilized society is known. I'll stress civilized society. So we are very much changing the climate system. There's no doubt about it. So, and scientists, when you put them together, are conservative. As Naomi Oreskes, who wrote The Merchants of Doubt, she's a science historian, say if you put bunches of scientists together, they err on the side of least alarm. And here's the late Steve Schneider, estimating sea level rise. IPCC assessments went all conservative, 20 to 80 metre sea level rise. Suddenly there's a whole lot of new science saying, right, you forgot to put in the ice melting from Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, and new measurements come in, they just left them out and didn't put in any error bars. And whoopee, your sea level rise estimates are now 50 to 160 centimetres, which are very much like the early estimates. So, and of course, Texas is burning, so things are happening. So really, I want to now draw on the Jewish tradition, and it very much has humans as guardians of the planet, and this is where I want to get into the ethics. This is the view of the full Earth taken en route to the moon in December 1972, and what we see, I think, when people could actually see the moon from above, they started thinking of the Earth as the actual system. And this is from Genesis: the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their array. So creation, basically, this is Judaic tradition, is seen as a closed system. It's complete, self-contained and dynamic. All actions are integrated in God's universe, and the impact of these actions affects the balance and system of life. This is showing you smoke from the 1980s Gulf War with the Kuwait oil wells were set alight. The massive plumes of smoke were photographed drifting over Kuwait and Saudi Arabian coastline. So if you look in ancient commentary from the Hebrew Bible, see that you do not spoil and destroy my world, for there will be no more after you to repair it. So very much Judaic tradition doesn't tend to look at life after death. It deals very much with the here and now, and that we are guardians. And really, there are three ancient traditions which come from the Jewish Midrash. We're reminded by God that we were created after the mosquito, that we are but a part of life, but not its heart. So we weren't created above. The Hebrew Bible teaches us how to act to maintain or to reinstate balance in the world so that we may live. And these Talmudic laws of environmental balance and protection come under three categories of Jewish law or halakha: Baal Tashmit, do not destroy; Shomrei Adamah, guard the earth; Tikkun Olam, repair the world. And it's interesting when you compare the 7 days of creation, or 7 epochs, depending on whether you take a geological view or biblical view, but the seventh day, the idea of the Sabbath, which was to rest, and the environment needs to rest and repair. So firstly, do not destroy. Secondly, guard the world. And thirdly, repair the world. And this is very much the three categories of Jewish law. So it is clear from the texts of the Torah, that's the 5 books of Moses, that God originally created a living biosphere, or something, you know, it came into being, wherein all systems functioned optimally and dynamically. Though the repair of the world may take many generations, we can begin today to find our way back to the harmony and dynamic life seen in, if we think of originally how the earth was as the Garden of Eden. So really it depends on each of us and all of us, and the choice is ours and the hard work will be ours. So really it's really a matter of guardianship and whether we choose life in a living biosphere or we choose just to let, shall we say, the rot go on and the destruction of the biosphere. So really, I think that's my 10 minutes. But I think really the whole Judaic tradition is about those 3 principles, and then you'll find if you think about them, they're thinking intergenerational because you're repairing, you're protecting, you're guarding. So I'll leave my comments there. And Rod, you're up next, aren't you?
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Andrew, for inviting me to participate in this. I mean, it's also wonderful to have a chance to talk about ethics and morality when it comes to climate change, because those are very, very central and essential elements which are very hard to get any kind of traction on when we talk about climate change. And more's the pity, because if lots of people did understand the issues from an ethical or spiritual point of view, then it might be a lot easier to do something about climate change issues. And that's the theme I want to elaborate on. Let me just deal first of all why we probably don't have much luck with a spiritual perspective. I think that the failure to muster anything of a spiritual response about climate change probably comes down to the plain fact that spirituality is such a diminished facet of many people's lives these days. So any kind of sense of relationship with or communion with or expressions of life and a sense of greater purpose of being is quite a foreign notion to many people. When it comes to a failure to muster an ethical response, I think this comes down to the nature of the climate change problem itself. And here I've long been very taken by a wonderful quote, which goes back now almost a decade, from Daniel Abbasi, who at that time was the director of Yale University's School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He's since retired. And he wrote almost a decade ago, "The problem of climate change is almost perfectly designed to test the limits of any modern society's capacity for response. One might even call it the perfect problem for its uniquely daunting confluence of forces." And he names 4. The first is that for many people, the issues seem remote in time and place. It's going to happen later, or it's going to happen to those people out in the Pacific Islands, not here. The second thing is that the issues are, of course, incredibly complicated. But the third one is the problems are politicized and obscured by the cultural filters we use. And I would argue that those cultural filters themselves are very faulty because of a lack of greater spiritual or ethical foundation to them. And then lastly, the way we organize society, politically and economically, means that the incentives and the motivations to seek and deliver collective action on this are very much thwarted. It's kind of every person for themselves. So in other words, we need to turn all of those issues on their head if we're trying to get any kind of response to climate change, let alone a moral or spiritual one. So firstly, we have to convincingly demonstrate to people that the issues are here and now. And they are. We are seeing extreme weather with patterns that are very much tied back to climate change. And as Jim has shown, temperatures and sea levels are demonstrably rising. We also then have to explain those issues in very true, engaging and accessible ways. Now, obviously I'm a bit of a romantic as a journalist. I believe that if something can be explained, and some things can't be, if they can be explained, they can be done so in ways which are still interesting to people who know a lot about the subject, but they're also very accessible to people who don't. The next thing is we have to try to reframe this very dysfunctional debate by shifting some of the political process away from its power as a force of denial and inaction into a driver of real positive change and progress. And I believe that's only going to happen if we develop very strong grassroots response to climate change, so people can feel practical, they're doing something useful to improve their life, make this infinitesimal change, because it's not the point that their change that they might make has any impact, because it is infinitesimal. But the real point is the fact they are trying to make a change is the real benefit. And once we got that grassroots response, we could really push politicians locally and then nationally to embolden them to go out and try and do more. And finally, we have to find ways to make collective action rewarding. And that's essentially what the likes of an emissions trading scheme or an international climate framework are meant to do. And we're still struggling to conceive of and to execute incredibly complicated sort of intellectual constructs about how those might work, because we're dealing in vastly unexplored territory. But I believe we can. But I also believe personally that we need to show the way to some kind of sunny uplands of success here, rather than threaten everyone with the dark chasms of failure. Sooner, probably, rather than later, we will need to do the latter if inaction persists. But I would still really hope that we could at least make a start by offering that sense that there is a better life out there for us all. So in response to the priming examples that Andrew posed, I think that if we get off more likely here than in many other countries, and the climate modelling suggests we will, we're not going to have the temperature extremes of the equatorial areas or the drought. But if we did that, of course, many people, I suspect, would not feel guilty about that at all. They would be glad that they're here, perhaps even being to the point of being quite smug about being God's own, though, of course, at that point, God might have disowned us by then. So it might be God's disown. Secondly, the question was what impacts might leaving a challenging legacy for future generations have on us here. And again, I suspect that the way things are at the moment, most people might feel vaguely badly about that, but it would fall into the same sort of category as famine in the third world. Look, we're really sorry about that, but these are forces far beyond us, and we sent off a bit of money to the missionaries or Oxfam, but that's probably about the best we can do. Heck, we even put a fart tax on our cows. Thirdly, the question was, if we took a leading role internationally, how would that make us feel about ourselves? Well, we do have a track record there. We were in San Francisco after the Second World War, bringing real intellectual horsepower to the debate about what should the United Nations look like. And we've continued to play roles like that, whether in the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs and Trade, GATT, or its successor, the World Trade Organization, or now in United Nations climate change negotiations. So it's no surprise that the current chairman of the Kyoto Protocol is a New Zealand diplomat, Adrian Macy. But I want to throw up a real paradox about leadership. And it comes down essentially to this. Back in the 1980s, we locked on to the cause of nuclear free with great alacrity, speed, and effectiveness. We were proud of our stand, and it helped us to shape our sense of who we were. Now, carbon-free should be even more galvanizing, but it isn't. And it isn't because it actually requires us to do something. Actually, albeit, I would argue, positive things. Whereas, of course, nuclear-free simply required us to say no. And if that made the Americans angry at us, that's even better. Who wanted to identify with those ugly bastards anyway, particularly so soon after the Vietnam War. So that nuclear-free versus carbon-free contrast actually gets a great deal starker when you look at it more closely, because our nuclear-free response was to a threat that would have indeed been utterly cataclysmic if nuclear holocaust had eventuated. But the risks of it happening were very long indeed, or at least they now seem so in historic hindsight. Carbon-free, though, should be our response to cataclysmic consequences which are already starting to unfold. The cost of doing nothing, human, financial, material, spiritual, is going to be enormous. The cost of doing something useful is actually small. That's what the Stern Report and others tell us. And yet it's really hard to engage people in that way. We still won't act. How am I doing time-wise? I'm not paying attention. Okay, good. I'll just give you a couple of examples of the really wonky thinking. First of all, it's the example of Philip Gregan and the Wine Institute. The problem with the wine industry in New Zealand is not an inability to produce a volume of wine. It's an inability to produce enough value from each bottle of wine. So there was a time until the global financial crisis where wine in New Zealand wine sold in the UK was per bottle average the most expensive imported wine, even more expensive than French wine. French, incredibly expensive wines, but very cheap wine. So on average, New Zealand wine was the most expensive imported wine. But since then, our wine industry has substantially trashed the brand. So you can now buy sort of 3-litre plastic bladders of Sauvignon Blanc, I use the word bladder deliberately, in UK supermarkets. So the problem is not trying to produce more wine. There will always be people around the world who produce more wine cheaper than us. So climate change doesn't change that at all. And I just have this life-size picture of us being very insensitive of perhaps a TV commercial in Europe for New Zealand wine some decades hence, of perhaps a former All Black who's known now more for being a character than people vaguely remember about his rugby. But anyway, fronting up to a withered French vine, saying, mate, you know, I'm really gutted that, you know, somebody's rooted your vines, but look, here's something to cheer you up. A 2-litre bottle of New Zealand wine, only €3.50. Well, you know, I don't think that's quite how we would need to respond. Secondly, Shadbolt in Invercargill, it's going to take more work for Invercargill than simply a 3-degree rise in temperature to make it a thriving metropolis of the south. Now, I'm actually down often in Invercargill, and I'm not being rude about Invercargill. I'm a huge fan of the Southern Institute of Technology and such people. But that is an amazingly idiotic response by Tim Shadbolt, because Invercargill is very, very low-lying, and sea level rises are really important. I'll end very briefly. Can I still go on a few more minutes? 5, thanks. Sorry, thanks for timekeeping. I was worried about wanting to say far too much. Let me go back to the spiritual questions. I like to use the example of, say, a tree. A tree absorbs water and minerals from the ground and carbon dioxide from the air. It uses sunlight to turn those into the building blocks of life. And it lives for hundreds of years. It cleans the air, it gives shade and habitat to plentiful life forms. It is self-cleaning, self-repairing, self-reproducing. Dying, it nurtures the soil. It also happens to be beautiful, inspiring lovers, artists, poets, and even some of the less sensitive among us. It comes in a profusions of models and varieties, each brilliantly adapted to its climate and terrain. There is nothing we humans have yet devised that comes anywhere close to the cleverness, complexity, and functionality and form of a tree. So it seems to me that if you don't have any sense of wonder about that tree, if you don't have any kind of spiritual relationship with that tree, you are deeply impoverished, and you and your community are the worst for it. Now, we Christians are not very helpful on this. Our theology has tended to revolve around dominance, that God created us so we could be in charge of stuff on earth, or stewardship. We would kind of look after stuff on earth. Well, those are both deeply flawed, even the stewardship one, which is more benign. The sheer complexity of nature and life on the planet is something that far transcends humans' ability to control or manage it. We talk about saving the planet, but we'll actually only finish ourselves off. The planet will go on for billions of years yet, and different life forms will evolve because that's the nature of the planet. The planet is far more robust than we are. Now, like theologians, I like to try to explain the inexplicable, seeing as I'm a journalist. So I'm not, but I'm going to be cautious about trying to suggest a new theology, other than very core Maori concepts like kaitiakitanga are incredibly important, because they see people as part of the ecosystem, and therefore what people do is an interaction with the ecosystem. We become part of that ecosystem. So for me, any kind of theology and any kind of climate change or spiritual response has to revolve around that. One last thought in terms of what might be our distinctive contribution to this. In the Anglican Church worldwide, in late November, we're starting to celebrate more often the feast of Christ and or creation. And I'm starting to focus on these issues of ecosystems and our relationships to them. I find it incredibly interesting that it is very easy for all the great faiths of the world to come together in the interfaith dialogue on climate change to offer very coherent views at Copenhagen. They will be back in Durban next month at this year's UN climate change negotiations, offering a very coherent, very consistent picture, drawing on all of those faiths. And where religion so often divides us or causes wars or other great disasters, I really believe that a common cause through faith and spirituality around the environment would actually do wonders, not only for the environment, but human relationships. One last thing about Christ and the Feast of Christ and all creation. And of course, that was something really pushed by the Archbishop of Canterbury up in the Northern Hemisphere, and Rowan Williams has said marvellous things like, we are consumers of what God has made, we are in communion with it. But of course, it's November, it's a horrible time of year in the UK. I mean, that's one of the reasons I live here. And it's about reaping what you have sown at that time of the year. Well, of course, and that's probably appropriate for how we've screwed up the planet so far. But of course here, November is spring. It's the season of new plantings, of new hope. So for us, as we celebrate the Feast of Christ and all creation here in New Zealand in spring, I hope we think of it not just as a religious, a spiritual, a theological exercise, but we are trying to create ideas, a real part of the creativity, to take out to the world to help us work on these otherwise overwhelming issues. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you tonight about climate change. It's somewhat out of my area of expertise, but I will do my best to link what I do know with what I don't know here tonight. The ethical framework that I want to propose to you is that of the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. And in the Christian tradition, of course, Jesus' instruction for those without sin to cast the first stone is but one reflection of that. In modern times, I'm particularly attracted to the people with disabilities slogan, "Nothing about us without us," which seems to me to also follow in that fine tradition. And I think this idea of connectedness is very important in the climate change debate. And I want to offer you thoughts from two notable folk. First of all, Elizabeth Warren, who's a United States politician, particularly interested in consumer protection, who recently said, "There is nobody in this country who got rich on his own. You built a factory out there, good for you. But I want to be clear. You moved your goods to market on the roads the rest of us paid for. You hired your workers the rest of us paid to educate. You were safe in your factory because of police forces and fire forces that the rest of us paid for. You didn't have to worry that marauding bands would come and seize everything at your factory and hire someone to protect against this because the work the rest of us did. Now look, you built a factory and turned it into something terrific. God bless. Keep a big hunk of it. But a part of the underlying social contract is you take a hunk of that and you pay it forward for the next kid who comes along." Of course, the thing she neglects to mention, of course, is they got rich because other people paid for the goods that factory produced, and they tended to be people who were a lot less rich than those who owned the factory. The other person I'd like to talk to you about is Robert Putnam, who's a researcher in the field of social connectedness and social justice, who says that the strongest predictor of crime rates is social capital. And crime is lower in communities in which there is a high level of connectedness. He also says that as a rule of thumb, if you belong to no group but decide to join one, you cut your risk of dying over the next year in half. If you smoke and belong to no group, it's a toss-up statistically whether you should stop smoking or start joining. And so it's really clear that human beings need connection, yes? That it's not just an ethical position, but it's a biological position. Practically, we literally cannot function without other people. Morally, we should not try to do so. So, of course, inevitably we get the argument then about individualism, and that I don't want to be shackled to somebody else, and we shouldn't all operate at the level of the lowest common denominator, which is the great fear of the collective. And I don't really think that that's a concern, because one of the other biological factors attached to human beings is that we adapt very, very well to short-term circumstance. There's a distinct evolutionary advantage to this, of course. You get your bad berries, your dangerous cliff, and your frightening tiger. You want to learn the first time around that these are things to be avoided, yes? But it does mean, of course, that our decision-making is predicated on short-term focus points. And unfortunately, short-term frameworks tend to be quite selfish. They're about my interests. That's all I've got time to think about. That's what I react to. The group's interests take longer. So that whilst we are needful of each other, it is a loose connection, not a tight connection. We're not ants or termites, but we are social creatures. And we'll come back to this idea that selfishness has a short turning circle in a few minutes. So the challenge lies not whether we are shackled to each other and will operate at the level of the lowest common denominator, because that's not going to happen. The challenge is whether we'll invite others to share the life preserver when it gets thrown. Planting out the vines. Andrew asked us to consider the ethical considerations of intergenerational responsibilities. If richer countries have responsibilities to poorer countries, developed countries because we started polluting first. And I confess this is a little more globally conceptual than I'm used to. So I thought as a way of sidling up to this, I might try and shrink it and get very, very local indeed and see what that might tell me, and possibly you, about this debate. So I want to talk about South Dunedin, because in many ways the way that the comfortable middle classes in Dunedin think about South Dunedin is the way we all think about overseas. Yes? The most frequently mentioned impacts of climate change are more extreme weather events, sea level rise, generalised warming of the mean temperature, and considerable consequential changes to flora and fauna, increased desertification. I'm not sure I'm saying that right. More sand, less trees. So I'm going to pick one because I'm trying to shrink this down into something I can cope with, and I'm going to pick sea level rise. And I'd like to give you some local sea level statistics about South Dunedin. Well, about Dunedin as a whole, but mostly South Dunedin. For every 10 centimetres the mean sea level goes up, groundwater goes up 9 centimetres. And we understand that mean sea level is the bit between high tide and low tide, yes? So it's not the highest the sea gets. Current predictions are for an average 1 centimetre a year rise in the mean sea level in the coast around Dunedin. In South Dunedin, the water table is as little as 25 to 40 centimetres under the sod. DCC is already pumping out salt water at high tide. Most of the houses in South Dunedin rest on wooden piles. And the truancy of children in the northeast valley of Dunedin can be predicted on which side of the valley they live on. Yes, if you live on the western side of the valley, you only get morning sun, and your chances of having a respiratory illness are that much higher than if you live on the eastern side, which gets afternoon sun. Truancy of children in the northeast valley is predicated on which side of the valley they live on. There is an immediate health impact that impacts on their lifelong experience. Yes, primary school education is absolutely critical to life performance based on how damp their houses are. I urge you to consider the conjunction of these facts. So it must be, obviously, if you live in South Dunedin, time to move fairly soon. Yes, but you can't. South Dunedin is the second most socially deprived urban area in the South Island. Typically this means low income, low level of education, low access to public transport, low home ownership, poor health outcomes, poor crime rates, all of those happy stories. And it's true. In South Dunedin, 60% of households have a total income of less than $20,000 per annum. More than 60% of residents aged over 15 are reliant on some form of income support. Nearly 40% have no personal vehicle. 3/4 have either never married or are now separated, divorced or widowed, and only 1/3 own their own home. So there's some consequences that we can draw from this information. And they go like this. It would be unwise to assume that many of those living in South Dunedin are aware of the likely impact of climate change. Possibly ignorant of climate change altogether, never mind the impact on them personally. It would not be wise to assume that they are interested. Many will see themselves as transitory or confused. Some are outside of the system or believe that due to their remaining life expectancy it won't impact upon them. They will not access information about this in the same way that connected, and it's called cultivated or concerned cultivation societies such as the middle class will. Renters will generally assume that they can relocate easily, but of course it's not possible for them all to do it at once. Because there is no infrastructure to absorb them, and if anything, Christchurch should have taught us that. Landlords will have no incentive to keep their assets in good repair, because who are they going to sell them to? The economic argument for a landlord is to let the asset run down. For those who do own, the value of their hard paid off asset will diminish just as the cost of replacement stock increases. And if their house is their savings, they will not be able to buy anything. Many older people, of course, hold on to their housing in order to have something to leave to future generations, and it will make them stubborn in the face of a threat to that asset. And for many of them, South Dunedin is an attractive place to live because the features there suit the residents. It's on the flat. You can get around on a mobility scooter. You can mow down hard-working social service workers on your mobility scooter. Yes, Dunedin doesn't have a lot of other flat land. And what it does have on the Taieri is at the same mean height above sea level. Yes. So where are we going to relocate them to? We know from endless initiatives to engage with homelessness that simply relocating folks doesn't work. You destroy what's left of their social fabric. And the recreation of ghettos, as in the British housing estate of the 60s, is equally problematic. So, that's South Dunedin. I've got a good grip on that. I can probably scale it up a wee bit now. Let's think about sea level change. It's just sea level change as one of the host of outcomes of climate change, and start thinking about, well, not just the Maldives, but the Netherlands, Louisiana, Manukau up north, Lower Hutt, Bangladesh, Mexico, most of the Pacific Islands, and in fact anywhere with a coast. It's not just going to be us. So what we can see is this, if we scale it up, those lessons from South Dunedin are The most affected are likely to be the most ignorant. They will respond late, and they will have few, if any, resources with which to respond. The market will not deliver a solution. Living conditions may actually worsen as governments are unable to finance the sustaining of necessary infrastructure, and additional social problems will arise as populations move. There will be hidden social costs in the affected communities that will play out over decades, and the problem is here now. So I'm going to tempt you with the golden rule again. But then I'm going to remember that we've all got a short turning circle about self-interest. And so instead of thinking about doing unto others as we would have done unto us, instead I ask you to remember Elizabeth Warren. Those who get and stay rich, and we are a supposedly rich country, do so by having others who buy our goods, work in our factories, pay our taxes, that provide our infrastructure to move our goods around and provide security for our plant and goods. And I ask you to remember that New Zealand is an export-led primary producing economy. Our quality of life, even in South Dunedin, is dependent on folks elsewhere. So this is a very, very small world. And to paraphrase the disabled people's slogan, the ethic right now is that it is about all of us right now. Thank you.
Okay, the question is of the panel, what are their perspectives on obligations to our Pacific neighbours who will be facing potentially forced relocations?
Yes, well, we have the largest Pacific Island communities in the globe. Auckland is the largest Pacific Island urban centre. I think absolutely. There's only 170,000 people we're looking at. We understand the culture, so I think this is the place to go. And Helen Clark, when she was Prime Minister, when approached by the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, said, of course, yes. Good old Johnny Howard said, no way. So I think they're our brothers.
I absolutely endorse that too. I would extend it slightly wider though. Although the number of people theoretically we could handle in large part just by bringing them to New Zealand, that may be not what they want to do, because even sort of Northland isn't necessarily particularly attractive to them. It may be a question of helping them move somewhere else. If that's the case, we should very much be their advocates and work with them to get the international support they need. So I would love to see New Zealand playing that wider role in humanitarian cases.
I couldn't agree with Rod and Jim more. I think they're absolutely right. I think there's the leadership opportunity and a friendship opportunity, and New Zealand has considerable resources, including our political connections and our international standing, to offer in support of the solutions that the people of those islands should be asked to help identify or suggest themselves. It's about their lives. It's not for us just to decide for them.
The question for the AV is what is the time frame involved in some of these changes?
Well, the current sea level rise estimates, the new estimates, between 50 and 160 centimetres by 2100. So if you take the mid-range, that's a metre by 2100. Obviously, it accelerates as you approach 2100. So probably in terms of serious stuff, for 2050 is probably when we need to take action.
And is that when we need to take action on both fronts, as the questioner asks?
Yes, well even now Tuvalu, for example, or Kiribati, you go there at king tides, basements of houses are starting to get flooded, and certainly there's salinisation of the atolls. So in a sense, time is very much running out for the Pacific Islands.
I mean, my thought on that would be that unless we want to play chicken with destiny now for all of them, is the urgency. But I take Rod's point, and I think he actually made it at a previous presentation, with the great unlimited resource that human beings have is our imagination. And I take his point tonight that I think there is considerable opportunity involved in all the change that's going to have to result. And whether we see it as opportunity or we see it as sort of coping with problems, it really depends largely on our mindset and what we think we can learn. And I think already we're seeing people learning a great deal out of the Christchurch earthquakes that will have a long-term benefit. There's an opportunity here for us to look at South Dunedin, Tuvalu, and look at brokering new technologies, be they soft or hard, as we move through it. You know, I think that the human race has always faced great challenges. This happens to be the great challenge we're facing now. And out of all of those great challenges, we've seen considerable opportunity for imagination, creativity and advance.
Thanks. But just to make sure we're not relaxed about this, whilst the impact is some decades away, we actually need to make all sorts of decisions now based on the precaution that we're expecting this to happen. So, for example, Christchurch City Council is working on a rebuild of the city, factoring only a 0.5 metre rise in sea level. That's pretty irresponsible, because they'll be making all sorts of decisions in Christchurch with very, very long effects, and they should be planning on 1 metre at least. Now, that won't protect Christchurch when sea level, should it go this way, end up being 5 or 7 metres, but at least you wouldn't be wasting resource at the you know, it'd be money well spent now, because the cost preparing for 1 metre now is minimal versus preparing for 0.5 metre, but you've got to take that decision.
Right, the question is, what's the role of short-term economic thinking in the political response?
I actually don't think there is a problem with short-term economics. It's only the way we're using economics. There are completely rational economic arguments for knowing that fossil fuels, or let's do with oil, will be heading beyond $150 a barrel, and the need to move on to other forms of energy, which certainly have climate benefits by not being carbon-based, make plain economic sense. So the economics actually stack up now. The only thing that's not working at the moment is short-term understanding. So this is a failure of humans, not of economics, which I'm not sure I want to debate that issue, but so don't blame the economics, just blame, and I'm not an economist, but blame the people trying to use the economics as an excuse for not doing something.
And I think here this is the understanding of economics where it hasn't costed in the environment, and Lord Nick Stern has said that has been the biggest market failure we've seen in the 20th century. So, and that really transforms it into longer term thinking.
Yes. Actually, see you're close, I will give you this.
A question about our perception of risk. We've focused on disasters, as we usually do as humans. Are there other things, for instance, changes in global climate, wipe out of harvests in Russia, across America, and the drop in production of basic stock for the industrial process, which will affect our trade on a much greater scale. All sorts of other resource impacts on transport with more storms and cost availability, those things. Are those the biggest elements we should be concentrating on, rather than the catastrophes which happen, such as in Christchurch and other ones that will happen with some fires, localised places? What's the context here? What are the bigger risks for New Zealand? Are the reaction to climate change from other countries forcing us to change, the reaction to the overall climate resource picture, or our own individual responses, say in Invercargill or whatever? Will they be overshadowed by the global picture?
I'll just colour in a bit of global picture. And the biggest impacts are the Arctic. And once that goes, this is the melting of sea ice and the melting of the tundra, and you release a whole lot of methane. And that, the critical level's about 1 to 2 degrees. We're almost there. Asian mega deltas have been talked about, and there's lots of millions of vulnerable people. Coral atoll islands, and basically Africa, which is subsistence living, drying out. But yes, we're in the world, and we're at the bottom, so things are going to tumble onto us, and it's really hard to fathom how they'll tumble out. But it's basically a long, slow burn. It's like droughts. People don't realise droughts creep up on you and suddenly you're there. So that's what we're dealing with. And we've got to get out of short-term thinking, actually.
Thanks. I think that the least of the risks that you identify there is the one around markets, where issues have already arisen, like the very spurious food miles debate, because it's not an issue of how far the food travels. If it is produced very efficiently, pasture-based rather than feedlot-based, for example, us versus Europe, and it travels by ship, that is very sustainable food production, and we can respond to those sorts of market issues. The by far the overwhelming biggest threat is one that we would all share in the world, which is those sorts of very major climate change impacts that Jim's enumerating. But I think there's a much nearer term impact, and it looks like this. We have an economic model at the moment which is has hit the wall in terms of how we earn a living in the world. We can't go on being a commodity producer. We're hardly lifting exports, even though this is the best terms of trade we've had in 37 years. And our two largest trading partners are the fastest growing developed country, Australia, and the fastest growing developing country. And yet, we're hardly shifting exports. So we've got a fundamental problem, economically, socially, environmentally, with how we earn a living. So in the short to medium term, i.e. from now out over the next 10 or 15 years, I argue very passionately we could significantly reorient what we're doing. We'd still be big farmers and all the rest, but we would reorient what we were doing so we would be starting to build in some true sustainability to how we earn a living. And so for me, the short-term impact, 5 to 15, say from now to 15 years, the real point is that if we don't move on that, if we don't start playing to these enormous shifts of global values and trends and all the rest, and we try to keep banging our head against the wall with our current economic model, we'll be in serious trouble. So for me, that's the most immediate risk. And the way out of that is to start building a different economy that brings strong sustainability right to its heart, rather than just kind of a spurious bit of weak sustainability to keep people slightly happier.
Do you mean self-sufficiency by sustainability?
No, because we could never be self-sufficient here in New Zealand. We could certainly produce all the food we need, but we aren't going to produce drugs or computers or aircraft or all sorts of other stuff. So we need to be, connected globally. I also want to make a very big distinction on growth between good growth and bad growth. Bad growth is that which is rampant and has all sorts of environmental, social, all sorts of other impacts, which is or uses resources in very unsustainable ways. I believe I believe that good growth is not. Sorry, this is rather complicated. Good growth is not an oxymoron, and we actually need growth because there are already 7 billion people on the planet, many of whom are not properly fed or housed, and we're heading for 10 or 11 billion by sort of 2050. And the only way that so many people are going to live well on this planet is by very radically changing the economics, the technology, the values, the systems, by how we do that. You know, humankind's got to make changes of a scale and speed that dwarfs anything it's ever done before. So that's about true sustainability, rather than thinking narrowly we can just hunker down. Well, we could, but it would be a pretty miserable life.
I think the single biggest potential crisis facing us is the political one. And whilst I have no expertise to debate this on, the economic model may be working fine, I'm not sure that the political model is working fine, in that if we continue to have short-term political decision-making and retrenchment of initiatives that are supposed to bring us into our responsibilities around climate change, then we're going to wind up having it happen to us. And there are already people starting to scaremonger about the kind of anticipated international migration pressures that climate change will bring and what will happen to New Zealand. If we leave it to the last minute, we'll be staring down the barrel of choices around politicians who either don't have a clue or who are reacting very, very poorly to a whole set of circumstance that it is now far too late to do anything constructive about. And those are situations where everybody loses out quite considerably.
Think of Greece at the moment.
Question is what are the opportunities for motivating lower socioeconomic groups to take action relating to climate change on their own lives and to do with their property?
The short answer is, gosh, I wish I knew. The long answer is I think that one of the things that's happened whilst people in my age group haven't quite noticed it over the last 30 years, certainly since probably the 88 Labour government, is there has been a real tearing at the fabric of New Zealand society. And a lot of the people you speak of don't have any property, and many of them don't feel they have quite the complement of rights that the rest of us do. We're looking again at a very micro level at South Dunedin. Roughly half the people who live there have lived there for more than 10 years, and they tend to be older, retired, and the other half have lived there for less than a year. There isn't a sense of neighbourhood. They don't talk to each other. Information doesn't move around. There is no connection out of which a movement can be born. And I think that South Dunedin would be in the sort of top 10 exceptional communities for that level of disadvantage and social dislocation. However, they're not unusual in New Zealand. The protest movements of the 80s seem to have been lost in the kind of materialism and individualism we've now gotten all fairly well stuck with. And certainly agencies like mine work very hard on the kind of community building and community organising that you speak of, but we do it in an environment of funding cuts and increased complexity. So it's a very difficult question, but I think it's a really good question to ask, because the moment we ask that question, we take some responsibility for trying to find an answer. And that's, I think, the first step towards what you're asking about beginning to occur.
I will talk about an ancient solution, and it's in Genesis, and it's the departure of the Hebrews from Egypt. And what was very interesting about all that, it was decided that the people that had been enslaved should not return to Israel, and they shouldn't be the ones that colonise and set things up, because the older people were too set in their ways, and really the whole idea of wandering around the desert was to have a new generation. And okay, you could, yeah. No, this is, anyway. I'll develop this further in South Auckland, which I'm more familiar with, and that colleagues of mine have been working on educating people in the primary schools in the decile 1 in 2 schools, because then they take the message home to their parents. And that's basically where we have to target. And a friend of mine has convinced me of that. Forget about the decile 9 or 10 schools. Go to the decile 1 or 2 schools in Manukau and maybe South Dunedin and get it to the primary school kids, who will then talk about it to their parents.
I absolutely believe it's essential to build communities that way. And so I'm a great fan of, for example, of the transition town movement. I would have seriously different views about engagement with the world economy in that sense, whereas that's not their thing at all. But that building of community by doing things together, by creating some collective goods like community gardens and the rest, I think is incredibly important. So you could start to, build community that way. And yes, you wouldn't be saying to them, we're off on a journey here to save you all from climate change. You'd just be trying to give them a hand to lift themselves overall. And so we start to create those communities that can respond far quickly to all these challenges. And communities where we can start moving at, say, the speed of the fastest third with courage, but also with compassion to help along on the journey everybody else who's finding it rather frightening or threatening. So that's the sort of community I would imagine.
Okay, we've got space for 1 complicated question or 2 simple questions. Just repeating that, what are the key questions to be asked, I presume, of politicians? Is that the idea? Yes, during the election campaign.
For me, there's a litmus test, which is whether a politician sees the relationship between environment and economy as a trade-off. The current government talks of balance between the two, or whether they see the environment, i.e. the ecosystem overall, actually as the only economy we have, and understanding that we can restore the ecosystem at the same time as build our economy if we go for good growth that is sympathetic to all that. So for me, that's always the litmus test. And that's all I need to ask in one sense. Well, a lot more flows from that. But for me, that's the litmus test.
For me, I guess it's more basic, that we've just got to stop emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and really keeping coal in the ground. And that's the big one.
Including lignite.
Yes. Oh, definitely lignite. But keeping coal in the ground, I grew up here. I can remember at school we were taught never to use lignite, and this was in the 1960s. It was very dirty stuff.
I'm slightly more of a radical, and I know that politicians respond to what they think the voting public want. And so my recommendation would be, don't worry about asking so much, but concentrate on telling. This is what matters. Rumour has it that the Labour Party, when in government, used to poll at least once a week, and that the National Party has taken that to extreme and now poll most nights. And are very, very evidently, all you have to do is watch the 6 o'clock news, evidently deeply responsive to public sentiment. I think the challenge here is to educate ourselves so that our politicians will follow us. Yes, not wait for them to lead. They're too frightened of being voted out by those who do have the very short turning circle of selfishness deep in their hearts. So I think that's the challenge here. And we may not have enough time for this election, unfortunately, but I think it's still a strategy worth pursuing.
Unfortunately, that takes us to within 2 minutes of our finish time, and these people have to catch, or 2 of them at least, I believe, have to catch aeroplanes, thus emitting a little bit of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but I'm sure their good works are making up for that. Very, very warm thanks to Rod, to Jim and to Laura for their very, very thought-provoking presentations tonight. I think I think what they're offering us are some really important, some critical insights into how climate change is not just a physical exercise, it's not just something that is going to be economically alarming to us all, but it's something that we must think about very deeply in terms of our spiritual beings and our ethical positioning of ourselves and for our grandchildren ahead of us. So thank you very much, you three. You've really got the debate going, and I hope we have many more events like this. Kia ora.